When the first Allied troops stormed ashore on the morning of June 6, 1944, they called it liberation. For the men waiting behind the machine guns, it was the end of the world. And when those guns finally went silent, something darker began. Because D-Day wasn't just about courage and freedom, it was also about revenge. And what happened to the German soldiers on those beaches, the ones who survived the first waves, was something that few men on either side ever spoke about again. The landings began before dawn. All along the French coast, men of the Wehrmacht were jolted awake by the thunder of naval artillery and the hiss of rockets from the sea. They stumbled into bunkers half-blind from sleep, clutching helmets and rifles as the entire horizon burned. For weeks, they'd been told the invasion could come any day. But when it finally arrived, there was no grand announcement, only walls of flame, collapsing concrete, and the sound of screaming through the intercom. At Omaha, strongpoints like WN-62 and WN-61 were manned mostly by teenagers and foreign conscripts, Poles, Czechs, and Eastern Europeans forced into German uniforms. Some didn't even understand the language of the orders being shouted. They fired blindly into the surf. Their machine guns tore through the first waves of Americans, but within minutes, return fire from naval guns and flamethrowers began ripping through the bunkers. And that's when the balance shifted. By mid-morning, small groups of Allied soldiers had broken through. They were soaked, burned, and deafened, crawling through the smoke with grenades clutched in trembling hands. For hours, they'd watched friends shredded beside them, waves of men cut down before they could even reach the sand. When they finally reached the bunkers, they weren't thinking about prisoners. Inside those concrete boxes, German gunners, some already wounded, were still trying to fight. But for many Allied soldiers, the line between combat and execution had already vanished. In theory, the Geneva Convention protected prisoners of war. But on D-Day, the reality on the ground was far from any rulebook. Some German soldiers did try to surrender. They dropped rifles, raised their hands, and stepped out of bunkers covered in ash and blood. But the men facing them weren't calm officers with notebooks. They were exhausted infantrymen, 20-year-olds who'd spent the last 2 hours watching their friends die screaming in the surf. One American sergeant wrote later that his men didn't feel like taking prisoners that morning. Another recalled how some of the boys just kept shooting. On Dog Green sector, after clearing one strong point, Rangers found several wounded Germans lying among the debris. They were killed on the spot. No orders. No hesitation. Elsewhere, engineers clearing minefields found men hiding in trenches. A burst from the Thompson was the only response. "Leave no one behind alive," one corporal wrote in his journal. "We couldn't risk them picking up a gun again." By midday, the beaches were littered not just with the dead, but with half-buried bodies in shallow pits hastily covered with sand. And among them were both sides, indistinguishable under the mud and smoke. Farther inland, Allied flamethrower teams and tank crews continued clearing what the bombardment had missed. The Germans had built their defenses deep into the cliffs, bunkers that were nearly impossible to take without close combat. To root them out, American and British troops used whatever they had: satchel charges, phosphorus grenades, even tank shells fired point-blank into concrete. Inside, defenders perished in the flames. Some stumbled out engulfed in fire, only to be cut down before they hit the ground. In one after-action report from the 116th Infantry, a lieutenant noted, "No quarter given." Another, more bluntly, wrote, "We didn't have time for prisoners." It wasn't always hatred. Sometimes it was fear, that a German with hands raised might still have a pistol under his tunic. Sometimes it was chaos, multiple languages, no communication, and nerves stretched to the breaking point. And sometimes it was payback. Many Allied soldiers had heard what German troops had done in occupied France. The massacres, the executions, the burned villages. On D-Day, when the tables turned, some felt it was justice being repaid in kind. By afternoon, as the beachheads expanded and organized command began to form again, the mood started to shift. Officers shouted for discipline. Military police moved through the captured positions, trying to collect the few surviving prisoners and prevent further killings. But by then it was too late for many. Some strong points that had once held 40 men were now silent, not because of surrender but because every defender inside had been wiped out. A war correspondent who arrived that evening wrote in his diary, "The smell was unlike anything I've known. Burnt cordite, flesh, seaweed, and diesel. We called it victory, but it looked like hell." By nightfall on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were finally in Allied hands. Smoke still curled from the wrecks of landing craft. The sand was darkened by oil and blood. And between the twisted metal and burned-out bunkers, hundreds of German soldiers lay dead, many killed in combat, others long after it ended. Official reports called it mopping up. But the men who were there knew what that really meant. On Omaha, one group of surrendering defenders, mostly Poles and conscripts, waved white rags from a destroyed bunker. The Americans approaching them hesitated only for a second before opening fire. It wasn't an execution in the formal sense. It was fear, adrenaline, and hatred, all in one heartbeat. No one filed reports about it. No one wanted to. The worst scenes came not from orders but from vengeance. Men who'd seen their entire platoons wiped out by an MG-42 sometimes found the gunners alive, wounded, begging for mercy. And mercy was rare that day. One eyewitness from the 116th Infantry remembered. 2 gunners crawled out of their bunker, both burned, both unarmed. One of our boys yelled, "That's for Charlie," and emptied his rifle. Another rode home weeks later, admitting, "We lost ourselves in that chaos. That beach turned us all into something else." At Juno Beach, Canadian troops faced the same rage. When they captured the 12th SS Panzer troops, some barely 17, they remembered the massacres the same division had carried out in France. And when the chance came, many Canadians didn't forgive. In some places, prisoners were found later with their hands bound and gunshot wounds to the head. War makes monsters on both sides. By evening, the task shifted inland, clearing the remaining defenses. Many German soldiers hid deep in underground tunnels and bunkers, hoping the Americans would move past. But the Allies weren't taking chances. Engineers sealed entrances with explosives. Flamethrowers were used again. The fire rolled through those tunnels like a living thing. One officer later wrote, "We called down into a tunnel, told them to come out. No response. We poured fire until the stone glowed. When we went in after, there was nothing left to identify. Inside some of those burned-out positions, the smell lingered for days." Medical officers and chaplains who inspected them afterward often refused to describe what they'd seen. To the soldiers who did it, it was survival. To history, it was a tragedy. By June 7th, thousands of prisoners had been taken, and many thousands more never got the chance. In captured strongpoints, the distinction between surrendered and killed while resisting blurred completely. Reports sent up the chain spoke only of neutralized positions. But within the ranks, whispers began to spread. Some soldiers couldn't sleep. Others drank. A few broke down entirely, realizing what they'd done in the heat of the moment. One medic described seeing an American private standing over a German corpse, shaking uncontrollably. He kept saying, "He was raising his hands. I swear he was raising his hands." As the Allied armies pushed deeper into France, stories of that first day began to fade under the weight of the larger campaign. But for those who landed at Normandy, the memories stayed sharp, the mixture of pride and shame. They had liberated Europe, yes. But the road to that liberation was paved with things they wished they could forget. Some years after the war, veterans of both sides met again, not as enemies but as old men. At memorials in Normandy, they shook hands, laid flowers, and stood together before the sea. But even then, the silence between them said more than words. They knew what had happened on those beaches. Not the version in textbooks or films. The real one, where mercy was lost for a few terrible hours and liberation tasted like vengeance. As one British veteran put it quietly, "We freed Europe that day. But part of us stayed buried in that sand." If you want to hear more stories like this, the ones that show war not as glory but as the chaos and cost that it truly is, help us out with subscribing. Because history isn't just about who won, it's about what it cost to win.